Now back to the timeline. At this point in time, Jesse and Frank are still riding with Bloody Bill Anderson, and Jesse acquires his nickname, which is Jesse Dingus. And how he does that, now this is his story. I've got my own theory about this. I mean, there's even other stories too about that a horse bit his middle finger off of his left hand. But at the time he was riding with Bill Anderson's guerrillas, a shot went off in his gun, and then he told the other guys that he was cleaning his gun, and the dingdest darndest thing ever happened, that he shot the tip of his middle finger off on his left hand. So after that, they started calling him Jesse Dingus, and that was his nickname when he rode with a group of people. They would call him Jesse Dingus. Now my theory is, at this time he'd have been like 16, 17 years old and not really still super familiar with guns and the way they work. And I think what he was doing was playing a little quick draw out of his holster. Now these guns that they used were single action. That means if you picked up the gun and pulled the trigger, nothing would happen unless the hammer was cocked all the way back. You'd have to actually first take the hammer, cock it back, and then you could pull the trigger and actually fire the gun. So what a lot of people practice when they first want to get familiar with the gun is drawing it, cocking it, and firing it. There's 3 steps. And for most people, if you use your left hand, you can speed that up a little ways, because if you draw the gun and use your thumb of your right hand to cock the hammer back, then what happens is you kind of change your grip, and you've got to reset your grip to fire it, so it can slow you down. But if you can take, at the same time you're drawing the gun out of the holster, take your left hand and use the palm of it to push the hammer back. At the same time the gun's coming out of the holster, you palm the hammer back, and then you can fire, and that makes the action a lot quicker. But the problem, if you're young and unfamiliar with guns, is in the first place, when you practice, you don't practice with an empty gun, mistake number 1. And second, you accidentally put it back in the holster with the hammer cocked, which is another dangerous thing too, because you could even possibly shoot your leg off. So what I am guessing really happened, based on my experience, and I've shot not just Civil War reproductions. I had a friend that restored Civil War revolvers, ones that were actually used in the Civil War, and I got a chance to shoot those. But my theory is he put the gun in his holster, cocked, loaded, pulled it out, stuck his finger in where the trigger was, and by the time he brought up his left hand to go over the barrel and start cocking the hammer back, he got nervous and pulled the trigger, and his middle finger of his left hand just happened to be in the wrong place in the wrong time, and playing quick draw, he shot off his middle finger. Because I don't think with a bunch of older guys that are experienced, if you're a young greenhorn, you want to walk over and tell them that you were playing quick draw and blew your finger off. That would be even sillier. I mean, he got the nickname Dingus anyway. What nickname he would have gotten if he'd have told him the real story, at least in my opinion, the real story of what happened, would have probably been even worse than Jesse Dingus. So that's my theory about that. Now, what happened with, I'm not going to go into the detailed story of it, because I kind of want to bring this to a conclusion and the end of the Civil War, where we get into the pure outlaw times. So, long story short, Bill Anderson was killed in the same way that he used to use to kill Union troops. He was ambushed, and going across a bridge after a bunch of Union soldiers were being chased by his group. He crossed the bridge into a 3-sided ambush, and Bill Anderson was shot and killed immediately. And Jesse and Frank did manage to escape the ambush and ride off, but a lot of guys were killed in it. So what they did later is they started riding with a guy called Archie Clement, and he was somebody that he was one of the lieutenants of Bloody Bill Anderson too. So they started riding with Archie Clement, but by this time it was getting towards the end of the Civil War, which I believe was, if I got my figures right, April 1865 was when it came to an end. So in May, Archie Clement's group, along with Jesse James, were headed towards Lexington to surrender. And at the time, amnesty and pardons were being offered, so the story goes that they were riding under a white flag of truce. But before they got to Lexington, they ran into a group of Union soldiers. And nobody really knows who fired first, but I'm guessing probably the Union soldiers probably just drew their weapons, and that probably spooked them. Even though they were carrying a white flag, they probably got spooked and maybe drew and started firing first, because I mean, there was nothing but hard feelings between these groups anyway, so you can't say that neither group was not really suspicious of each other. And what happened then was the guy that was riding a horse next to Jesse James, his horse was shot and fell over and knocked into Jesse James' horse, and at the same time Jesse James was shot in the chest. And that was actually his second chest wound. He'd been wounded before, but this was the second time he got shot in the chest. And because the horses fell over, and in all the commotion and everything, he was able to crawl into the bushes and hide, and they weren't able to find him. So what he did after then was he made his way back to the family farm, and that's kind of the time he was recovering from that chest wound at the family farm, was kind of the time that him and his first cousin Z, she was taking care of him, because even if you survive a chest wound, the recovery time is really long, but his cousin Z Mims was caring for him during that time, and that was when they kind of hit it off and decided to become romantically involved. But while this was happening too, and he was recovering from the chest wound that he received while trying to go to surrender, a group of militia came out to the house looking for him, and he certainly wasn't going to surrender himself to the militia, because he'd have probably been shot again or hung or something. They probably wouldn't have let him live. So what he basically did was he fired 2 or 3 shots through the front door to get them to duck for cover, and then he ran out the back door and got on his horse. And because he knew from riding with the guerrillas to always keep a horse saddled and packed and prepared, him and Frank, whenever they visited the family home, always had horses ready to go at a moment's notice. He was able to ride away and escape from that. So that is the conclusion of all the Civil War era. What I'm going to get into next is the first robbery, and actually the first peacetime daylight robbery of a bank.